Hello there, cat people. Dan the Catman here, along with Michelle the Meow Maven. Hello, Michelle. David, did you know Michelle is the author of a book as well? She wrote a book called The Farty Feline. That's actually true.
I could use that book for
It is
reasons I won't go into.
It is a scientific study. No, it's not. It's a children's book on a cat who had a nervous condition, and we'll leave it there. But also joining us is Stephen from catbehaviorhelp.com, Stephen Quant. He is our producer and our resident cat behavior help expert. So welcome, Stephen and Michelle.
Hey, Dan, Michelle, David, all great to see all of you.
Hi, everybody.
And welcome to episode 63 of the Shelter Cats podcast, the podcast created by Shelter Cats. And joining us tonight, for this recording, is David Grimm, author of the book Citizen Canine, Our Evolving Relationship with Cats and Dogs. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
Before we get started, we have to do a little business. Michelle, take it away.
Sure. The Shelter Cats podcast has joined the Chewy Shelter and Rescue affiliate program. Chewy's mission is to be the most trusted and convenient online destination for pet parents and partners everywhere. Chewy is passionate about supporting animals and making a positive impact in communities across the country. Local shelters and rescues oftentimes serve as a first home or provide continued support to pets. That is why Chewy is committed to supporting organizations that benefit the overall health, safety, and well-being of shelter and rescue animals. Please click the link in the podcast description. You'll not only be helping your local shelter, you'll also be supporting this podcast. So thank you to Chewy.
Thank you, Chewy. We love Chewy. David, thanks so much for joining us. It's really, really a fascinating book. But first, I have to ask, I know, there it is, thank you. He listened to it, because I'm an audio person for
Me too.
books.
Me too.
My dad and I used to argue about that. That's not real reading, but I always disagree. I know you and David, how did you and Stephen, we'll edit that out. How did you and Stephen meet up and become friends? I know, I hear that's a very interesting story.
It is an interesting story, and Stephen can correct me when I stray from the facts. But my family moved to New York about 5 years ago, right in the middle of that first summer of the pandemic, which was a lot of fun. And I think, I'm trying to remember the exact. Maybe it was 2021 actually. Maybe within a year of moving, we had adopted 2 kittens, speaking of shelter cats, from Brooklyn Rescue, and Iggy and Spud, who we still have. We got them when they were about maybe 4 or 5 months old. And unlike our previous cats, they sort of, especially Spud, came with some kind of annoying behavior problems. He went psychotic whenever we broke out food. He would almost literally do parkour off the walls in the kitchen, and he was scratching people up because he just couldn't control himself when he saw food. And that was his main issue. There may have been a couple of other issues. Even though I wrote a book about cats and dogs, I am not an expert in cat behavior. And so on a whim, I can't remember exactly how I came across Stephen's name. I may have asked a community group on the island, or may have done a Facebook search. Stephen, how would I have found you? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think you said something about you got some sort of referral from somebody.
I think I did,
a guy on the island.
I think somebody on the island. So Dan and Michelle, if you don't know, Stephen and I, I'm sure you know about Stephen, but we both live on Roosevelt Island, which is this tiny little slice of paradise in the middle of the East River, just across from the east side of Manhattan. It's sort of wedged between the east side of Manhattan and I guess Long Island City and Astoria in Queens. But anyways, so somebody recommended Stephen. I shot him an email. I didn't hear back. And I think that was because it maybe went to spam. And so I was just like, oh, this is, I was like, well, this is not going to work. And then I think a few days or maybe a week went by, I re-emailed Stephen. He was deeply apologetic because I don't think he had gotten my original email. And it turned out he lived right across the street from me. I'm not even sure I knew Stephen lived on the island. Maybe I did know that. But anyways, he said, well, why don't we do this? It was still pandemic times. He was like, why don't we do Zoom? And I'm like, I think you're right across the street from me. Can you come over? And I think Stephen was a little, I don't want to put words in your mouth. He was a little hesitant, as we all were, about social interaction, but he sort of bit the bullet, put a mask on, decided to come over, and
I didn't
charge
history.
You.
Tell me I didn't charge you.
I don't think you You may have. I don't think you would charge me now, but you did charge me then. And it was well worth it. Whatever you charged me, Stephen, it was well worth it because I have to. This is in all honesty. Within Stephen spent, I think, an hour in our apartment and gave me all this advice. And I frankly didn't believe it. I'm like, it can't be that straightforward. And I think within a week, we had already started to see results. And within, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, Spud was behaving very normally and has been ever since. And it was just such a gift because we were sort of at our wits' end and didn't know what we were going to do. And long story short, which I realize is too late for that, that was our first meeting, and Steve and I struck up a really nice rapport, and we've been friends ever since. We get lunch all the time on the island and talk about cat stuff and other stuff, and it's just been a real pleasure getting to know him since moving to New York.
And to make a pitch for lunch, there's this new coffee shop on the island called Cafe Aviva, and it's
you guys getting money for this?
No, it's really nice. And now they have an awning outside and outside tables, and David, we've got to go there soon.
100%.
Cafe Aviva, if you're listening, we would love to have the podcast catered. We do drink. This is tea, not anything stronger. We wouldn't mind having snacks during the shows as well. We did a 2-hour podcast. Don't worry, David. We've done some long episodes, so catering is definitely welcome, Cafe Aviva. Anyway, that's actually an awesome story. So you didn't answer his first email, Stephen?
I didn't see it.
Okay.
I try not to take it personally.
I was looking across the park from him, and I could practically see in his windows, but I didn't see the email, but we worked it out. So,
well, yeah. I'm glad you did, because you may not have been here otherwise.
And it's a great book. It's a funny book. It's got great stories. We're obviously going to talk about it.
Yeah, the whole time I was listening to the book, a lot of like my childhood in Brooklyn kept coming back into my head, and how people perceived having cats as pets, and just the differences between like 40 years ago, putting cats out for the night, like the Flintstones song. All that kept resonating in my head. My uncle had cats in his lampshade store in Brooklyn, and he'd leave them out at night. And it was almost considered cruel to keep them indoors at night. He would let them out. They'd had a cat door, and they were expected to leave. So the whole time, I was listening to your book, those kind of memories from childhood kept coming back to me of just how the 80s, the 70s, not even all that long ago, but just how differently people felt about cats, treated cats, thought cats needed to behave. So that being said, just making it a little personal, just what sparked your curiosity about the evolution of cats and dogs as pets? How did that lead to a curiosity that led you to write this book? I guess to start.
Yeah, I think, and I read about this a little bit in the book, but, our previous cats, who I sort of already alluded to, Jasper and Jezebel, who unfortunately passed away both in 2021, Jezebel passed away shortly before we got against by Jasper, shortly thereafter. But, when we used to live in Baltimore, we were in Baltimore for 15 years before we moved to New York City. And I think it was we adopted Jasper and Jezebel, I think around 2005, 2006. 2005, I think. And within a few months of getting Jasper, he went into massive kidney failure. And, we didn't have kids at the time. These were our kids. And my wife and I were just devastated. We rushed him to the emergency room. Eventually, first we took him to the vet, and then we took him to the emergency room just outside of Baltimore, called the Pet ER, and where we were basically told over and over again he was going to die. And, sitting there in the emergency room, Dan, exactly to your point, and seeing all of the other sort of pet parents there with, dogs and cats sort of in intensive care, and they're pulling out the second credit card to pay for whatever's going on, and just thinking about and we ended up spending, and this is when my wife and I were just basically just starting our careers. So we had not very much money, and we ended up spending, I think, about $3,000 because he was in the intensive care for a few days, and they were doing ultrasounds, and they had him on IVs and 24-hour watch. And thank God, he pulled through. And not only did he pull through, and they told us even if he pulled through, he was not going to live a long life. He pulled through, and he lived for 16 years. He actually lived longer than his sister. And it's just, we sort of joked it was sort of the miracle of Hanukkah with Jasper. I mean, he just, told us he was going to live for like, a few days and ended up living for 16 years. But, just sitting there in that emergency room and realizing, again, to your point, Dan, like, how do we get here? Like, how do we get to the point where we can spend this much money on our pets, where we're willing to spend this much money on our pets, and how much of a change that is just from a few decades ago, where you couldn't, even if you wanted to spend that much money to save your pet's life, you couldn't, and nobody in the right mind probably would have, because they would have sort of been laughed out of the room to get thinking about a kidney transplant, which thank goodness we didn't have to even consider eventually. But, it's just, how did we as a sort of society get to this point that we have such an intense relationship with these animals?
Yeah, the evolution is fascinating to me. Absolutely. So, did you want to, Michelle?
Oh, sure. I was reading through your website and your various blogs and things on there, and there was one section where you were talking about different ways that animals are perceived and things like that. And one of the statements that you said was that there are some philosophers that feel that the only way we can save society is by eliminating cats and dogs from the face of the earth. And I was a little bit taken aback by that. Like, what is the logic in that? What's the idea behind that?
Yeah, as the book goes on, so the book is sort of traces cats and dogs from the very beginning. I talk about sort of where they come from, who their ancestors were, and sort of how the very early days of cats and dogs, how they became domesticated and how they began to become part of society. Dogs with hunter-gatherers and cats probably in ancient Egypt. Even though I say in the book, this is the latest turn of the screw. I work for Science Magazine, and one of my pleasures about being there is they let me write about cats and dogs a lot. But a long time ago, people thought cats came from ancient Egypt because there's all this stuff associated with cats with ancient Egypt. And then there was this discovery about 20 years ago, what appeared to be a cat buried with a human thousands of years before ancient Egypt even existed, in this Mediterranean island called Cyprus. And then just most recently, a couple studies came out that said, no, probably was ancient Egypt. That was probably a bit of a red herring. But, as the book goes along, it gets into trickier territory. I talk about, how they became part of society and part of the human household. But towards the end of the book, I really talk about sort of some of the ramifications of us sort of turning pets into kind of not people per se, but almost fellow citizens in a way. And yeah, there are a couple of folks I talked to who sort of think cats and dogs, even though they in fact, the guy who said that, who you're quoting, Michelle, is a big dog guy, but his name is Gary Francione. I believe he's still at Princeton. But at least when I wrote the book, it sort of espoused this view that like cats and dogs are this sort of weird creation. They're sort of this weird hybrid between pet and person, and the way we treat them is really weird. And it's sort of society, because it's sort of breaking down these structures of what it means to be a person and what it means to be a citizen. And so, there are people like him, I think they call themselves abolitionists, but abolitionists in sort of the pet sense of the word, this idea that like, as much as we love cats and dogs, they're too much of an artificial construct. And so, society would be better off if we didn't have them. Now, clearly that's a minority view, but that was one of the things I really wanted to get into the book. Like, I didn't want this to be kind of a fluffy book. Like, I really wanted to get into some tricky stuff with pets, and it's not all sort of sunshine and rainbows. There's as the status of these animals continues to evolve, there's pushback and there's complications that arise from that evolving status.
See, because I would think that my point of view, and maybe I'm sure you guys all agree, is that having pets kind of enhances your humanity. Like, I feel like it teaches you compassion, it teaches you empathy. You learn how to, the general thinking is that as a child, if you lose a pet, it teaches you about grief before you have to learn it by losing, a loved one. So it's kind of like an introductory way to learn about grief. It's a way to like deal with, human emotions, but in a little bit of a different angle. So it kind of helps you evolve as a person. So it's so fascinating to me to see that I've never even heard the concept that they're like a detriment to us in that sort of way. It's just
It's
interesting.
really not a mainstream view, but it was something I really wanted to get into because again, I wanted to get into all of the recesses of this weird evolving status of cats and dogs, and there's a lot of really great things about that. I think that we treat these animals so much better than we used to, and they get so much better care than they used to, and they're so much more legally protected than they ever were. But there's also some weirdness that comes along with that as well, and I didn't want to shy away from that.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting, and there, there's legal discussion in the book about what it means to be a person versus an object or possession, and the idea that at some point dogs and cats could get their own lawyers and sue each other, and it kind of goes down this interesting rabbit hole. But I'm curious, David, if I'm about to ask you a big question that you could probably just take the rest of the talk about, but if you could distill a little bit for us the journey that you think that wild animals as dogs and cats were to how they came to be pets and essentially, I put this in air quotes, owned by people and members of society. And I'll just mention to you as a reminder, this great story you told in the book about this legal case between this guy named McCleary, who accused his neighbor, whose name was Friedel, something like that, of stealing his cat, and the judge who got involved and had to make a decision about all of that.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite story in the whole book. And I spent 4 years on this book, so there's a lot of stories in there. I traveled the country and I talked to a lot of different people and made a lot of very interesting visits. But this was a story, I knew almost nothing about the law before I wrote this book. And I learned so much about sort of how the law works, how courts work, how precedent works, how the law sort of creates these things out of sort of case law. And that's certainly what's happened with cats and dogs. But yeah, this is my favorite story in the book is, and this, I don't remember the exact timeline, but I believe it was the late 1800s. And maybe Stephen, you can correct me. It's been a while, maybe late 1800s, early 1900s. And I love it also because it took place in Baltimore, which I have a real soft spot for because I lived there for so long. But basically the story is that, and this is a true story,
Sorry about that, guys.
No. I was like, it wouldn't be a cat podcast without the appearance of a cat. But
That's Vance, everybody.
Vance. Okay. Maybe he'll come back.
1894.
1894. Thank you. I believe I knew it was. Thought it was the 1800s. Anyways, long story short, it's a Baltimore neighborhood. A man apparently sneaks into a woman's yard at night and steals her cat. She realizes the man has done this. She has the man arrested. The constable, that's how long ago it was, the constable comes and arrests this guy in Baltimore and brings him before the judge. And the judge is like, man, I don't even know if I can charge you with anything. Like, what is the legal status of the cat? And he actually consults all these other judges in Baltimore, including one who happens to be a close relative of Edgar Allan Poe. So there's a lot of just fun details in the story. But, and the judges sort of, talk to each other and they basically conclude that a cat has, like dogs at the time, have no legal status. They, people have a legal status. They're people. Farm animals have a legal status. They're considered property at the time. Your toaster has a legal status. It's considered property, just like your car. But cats and dogs are so low on the legal totem pole that they don't have any status. They're not even worthy of being considered property. And so the judge says, a cat's not property. So in effect, you haven't stolen anything. So he let the guy go. And first of all, it's just a really cool, fun story with a lot of great color that I had to go through. I'm searching through these law articles from the late 1800s, and I'm just like, I never imagined in my life I'd be looking at this stuff and realizing how fascinating some of this stuff can be. And I'm looking at old articles in the Baltimore Sun, which actually get reported on the case, which is like, I think it was a slow news year or a slow news day. But I love it also because it's just a great example of, you talk to any pet owner today, they'll say, of course, not only is my pet a piece of property, it's a family member, should have all these legal protections. And just to think, a little over 100 years ago, and this was a legal situation that lasted well into the, early to mid 1900s, where cats and dogs really had no legal status, that they basically had no right. Somebody could steal your cat and dog, somebody could shoot your cat and dog. Nothing would happen because there was absolutely zero legal protection.
Interesting. And I'm curious if you also just know, was there a court case or something that happened legally that started the shift and allow cats or dogs to start to be viewed as having value?
Yeah, so I think starting in the early 1900s, again, you would have these cases where somebody's dog would be hit by a train, somebody would sue the train company, nothing would happen because the dog wasn't property. But as pets, as their status starts to increase, and I write about this in the book, this is around the time, especially where dogs are coming indoors. Dogs start coming indoors in the late 1800s because of flea and tick shampoos. Let you bring your dog indoor. Nobody wanted a dog. It wasn't even if you loved your dog to pieces, you wouldn't want your dog inside because your dog had parasites and your dog smelled terrible. And you wouldn't want that in your house. And so that's why dogs were out in the doghouse, or chained up in the backyard or whatever. And cats weren't coming inside because, Dan, to your point, and this was, the case with my family a little bit growing up. You let your cat roam the neighborhood. There was no litter. Kitty litter wasn't invented until the 1940s. And so even if you wanted to lock your cat up at night, where's your cat going to go to the bathroom? And so as cats and dogs start coming inside, this is one of the things I write about in the book. I think this is probably the most important thing that's ever happened besides their initial domestication, with the status of cats and dogs, us sort of bringing them inside where they're no longer an animal. They're not even no longer a pet because but they're coming inside, they're starting to sleep in your house, they're sleeping on the couch, they're sleeping with you, they're sleeping with your kids. All of a sudden, this is, in my opinion, this is the beginning of the road to them becoming family members. And so you have this happening, you have the rise of the pet industry happening around this time, you have the rise of veterinarians starting to pay more attention to, cats and dogs are something we should pay attention to, not just cows and horses. And so when these cases start coming before judges, now all of a sudden cats and dogs have this importance they didn't have before. And slowly but surely judges start saying, okay, yeah, this cat has value. It's worth $50 or, whatever. This dog's worth $100. And that builds and builds and builds until, you have people, decades later fighting over custody of their pets and all this other, and dogs getting lawyers and all this other stuff that's been happening in the courtroom over the past couple of decades. But that really starts with judges starting to acknowledge that, okay, these are entities with a legal value and that we can start assigning. And if people hurt this animal or steal this animal, there will be legal repercussions, which never happened before.
Very interesting.
So kind of one of the things that hooked me into the book was, I think you even said it a couple of times, is why was it cats and dogs and not foxes or some other animal? Like, how did they get so lucky is kind of my interpretation of it. Can you talk a little bit, again, without giving away the whole book, can you talk a little bit about how they became domesticated? I know this is going back and back, but
it's fine.
How did cats and dogs end up becoming domesticated, brought inside, and thought of as companion animals?
Yeah, so dogs, and this is one of my favorite things to write about because it's a mystery, and every good journalist loves a mystery. But we still don't know exactly when or where or even how dogs were domesticated. We have theories, and there's research being done on it. But the general consensus is it probably happened sometime around 20,000 years ago, which is a long time ago. That's before anything else was domesticated, before any other animal, before any other plant. Dogs were the very first thing humans ever domesticated. We're not sure where it happened. Could have been Europe, could have been somewhere in China, somewhere in Asia. We just don't know exactly where. Siberia has had a lot of attention for dog domestication. But this is a time where humans are hunter-gatherers. They're living hand to mouth. They're roaming around. The last thing they have time for is to take an animal, try to care for an animal when they can't even care for themselves. So it was probably a very passive thing. The idea likely is, the reigning theory is that humans are sort of moving from encampment to encampment. They're leaving a lot of trash around, a lot of old, bones and stuff like that. Gray wolves, which are the direct ancestor of dogs, are sort of maybe those they're trying to get a meal. Those who are the least fearful of humans are the most likely to approach that campsite. And those that are most likely to approach that campsite, who are also the tamest, are also most likely to be able to reproduce because they're surviving better, because they've been able to sort of get a little close to humans and eat their scraps. And so the idea is over probably thousands of years, at least hundreds, probably thousands of years, you have this wild animal kind of passively, some people use the word self-domesticating into a very early dog. And again, even when that happened, people are not like, oh, great, a dog, like something else I get to take care of. These animals would have been not seen as pets and probably not as companions. They would have been seen as coworkers. Okay, dog, you're here, you're going to help me hunt this mammoth, you're going to help me chase down this rabbit, you're going to protect my hut at night or whatever against coyotes and wolves and other people. And so dogs have this very critical, people who had dogs are probably more likely to survive. And so there's even this theory that like dogs helped us evolve because, they not only were we important for their survival, they were important for our survival. And so you have this really tight bond that's probably a lot based on a mutual codependence more than any sort of sentimental relationship. I mean, we don't have a time machine. We have no idea, but that's probably likely. And very similarly for cats, whether it was, 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, certainly a lot more recently than dogs, almost on the other end of the domestication spectrum from dogs, because by then you have some livestock being domesticated, maybe even before cats. But again, maybe the idea is maybe earlier farmers, they're growing grain. The grain's bringing in rodents from the desert. This is probably in the Middle East. Cats we know a little bit more about probably where they were domesticated. It's probably somewhere in the Middle East /Mediterranean. The when is still a little bit unclear, but a few thousand years ago. And so the cats are coming in hunting the rats and the mice. And again, they're the cats that are most comfortable around humans are the ones most likely to stick around. They're the ones most likely to survive. And you have maybe, again, the self-domestication process. This most recent study I wrote about posits this very interesting theory, which is mostly speculation, but, it posits that Egyptians, they had this goddess Bastet, who used to have the head of a lion. Bastet first came on the scene maybe about 5,000 years ago. I may be getting that wrong. Maybe about 3,000 years ago. I think about 3,000 BCE. Don't quote me on that. Anyways, she has the head of a lion. Over the course of time, these cults arise around her. She starts to get the head of a cat, which is really interesting. And the thing about Bastet is, if you were a follower of Bastet, you would go to these temples, and the way you would show your devotion is you would order yourself up a cat mummy. And Bastet became so popular, and the demand for cat mummies became so intense that people were literally herding cats, or at least, having them bring these cats or wild cats. The direct ancestor of the cat is an animal known as the Near Eastern wildcat or the African wildcat, which looks a lot like a cat but doesn't act a lot like a cat. And they would bring these cats in, or maybe these proto-cats in. And as these cats are in these temples and being sacrificed by the literal millions, so one of my scientists who's heading this research calls it the murder domestication pathway. This idea is that even though you're killing all these cats, you're also bringing a lot of them together. They have to get used to being around people, and that is leading to the domestication process. So, and again, cats would have served a function, whether they were important as sacrificial animals, whether they were important as rodent control, whatever they were. Again, they probably were not seen as pets and fur babies in ancient Egypt for the most part, although the ancient Egyptians did become very protective against them. Apparently there was a law in ancient Egypt that if you took a cat out of Egypt, you would be killed. And I think you could actually even be killed for killing a cat, which doesn't make any sense given that there were millions of cats being killed as sacrifices. But, this is all sort of speculation. But again, cats and dogs were very much seen as serving a utilitarian function early in their lives. And it was this companionship role is really a very recent phenomenon.
That's absolutely fascinating. They had to seriously earn their keep at first, it sounds like.
They really did.
And as you could tell, mine earned their keep by, trying to knock over the microphone at every waking up. But they're cute, so I get away with it.
All right.
How long did it take you? How long did the research for this? Because you mentioned you're not a pet expert per se. What is your background?
Well, so I would consider myself a cat and dog expert. I mean, I would consider myself an expert on the status of cats and dogs, the origins of cats and dogs, even the cognition of cats and dogs. What I'm not an expert on is what Stephen's an expert on, which is definitely not an expert in behavior. But, I'm a journalist at Science Magazine. I have been for about 20 years now. The more sort of seniority I got at Science, the more I was able to sort of be able to start to pick and choose the stuff I could write about. And I wanted to be a vet when I grew up. That was what I thought I was going to be. And so I've always had a love of cats and dogs and an interest in cats and dogs. And this was sort of a very full circle moment for me. I actually trained to become a scientist. I have a PhD, but switched to being a journalist about 20 odd years ago, and was able, not too long thereafter to start writing a couple stories about cats and dogs. And that was years before I really wrote the book, but it gave me a foundation in sort of the science of these animals and just a lot of the experts to talk to for the book.
Could I jump in with just a quick related question having to do with, something that always fascinates me, which is the difference between domestication and socialization. And there's a part of your book, David, where you visited this wolf sanctuary. And maybe you could describe for us, as you understand it, the difference in social potential between wolf pups and dog pups. And on that same subject, speak to their respective differences with this very interesting idea of being able to recognize pointing or not able to recognize pointing and what that all means.
Yeah, so one of the visits I did for the book was this place called Wolf Park, which is in Indiana, and this is a place, one of the few places in the U.S. at least, where there's actually like a wolf sanctuary where they actually have wolves there that the public can visit. The public is usually generally not allowed to go in with the wolves. I think some people can, but scientists also go there to study wolves. And I think I'm glad you brought that up, Stephen, because I think that's a really common misconception is this difference between tame and domesticated. And so you can tame a tiger, you could tame a wolf, but the offspring of that animal are going to be just as wild as that animal is. There's nothing permanent, at least generationally, about taming. And I saw that with the wolves. These were animals that, people might say, well, a wolf's pretty similar to a dog. Like, how different can they be? And these animals had undergone hundreds of hours of socialization since they were puppies. They were intensively socialized. They're living with people. They're interacting with people 24/7. And yet you go into an enclosure. I had to do an hour safety lecture before I even got into that enclosure with those animals. Everything you're supposed to do if they attack you, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to respond, how do you basically avoid getting killed with an animal that's had hundreds of hours of socialization. And standing there with the wolf, you feel it. You feel the unpredictability. You feel them not really trusting you. And that's not compared to anything what it would be like to interact with a wild wolf, a truly wild wolf, even if you could. And so this idea that like tameness just happens overnight is just not true. I mean, whatever happened with cats and dogs likely happened over hundreds or thousands of years. It's just domestication is ingrained in the DNA that becomes part of the programming of this animal, and not only just the programming, but their whole genetic makeup. And so a cat, even if it's never encountered humans, that's going to be a feral animal. But if that cat has a kitten, as long as and Stephen can probably speak to this much better than I can, if that cat has a kitten, as long as you get that kitten early, that's going to be the most domesticated animal you ever met. Even if its parent was this crazy not wild, but feral animal, domestication is just part of the domestic cat's genome. And so those offspring, there's a window with cats, there's a window with dogs as well. But as long as you get them during that early window, this is going to be a lap, maybe not a lap cat, but certainly this is going to be, as domesticated as any other cat.
Well, yeah, but okay, I'm with you on all of that, but contrast that with the silver fox experiment and domestication experiment in Russia that is ongoing to this day, and the speed at which, through genetic selection, they were able to make changes in foxes in terms of sociability.
Yeah, so this is a famous experiment called the Fox Farm experiment that happened, I think, in the 50s, or started in the 50s, maybe 50s, 60s in Siberia, going back to Siberia. And this was a guy, Dmitry Beylev. I'm going to completely mangle his last name. But he had this crazy idea of, can we take a wild animal like the fox and turn it into a domestic animal? And there's this idea. And so basically what he did was he would take foxes, and the foxes that bit, or, try to attack their handlers, those got turned into fox fur, basically. And so he would keep the ones that didn't. Okay, now we've got ones that are a little less bitey. Let's breed those guys. Okay, now these guys are a little less bitey, and they're more likely to approach humans. Okay, let's kill all the ones. I don't know if they're killing them. They were maybe selling them off to fur trappers or whatever, but fur makers. But, but let's keep the ones that are slightly more tame. And they did this a generation. And I think over the course of, I don't remember exactly how many years it was, they were able to turn these animals into something that almost resembles a dog. Their tails wagged, their coat color changed, they lost the traditional fox fur, they started to get kind of interesting patterns, sort of like we see in dogs today. I have to say, Stephen, and I'm just catching up on this myself, there is some controversy around that experiment. Apparently the foxes, so people, for decades, people have heralded this as like, okay, this is how domestication works. You can, and keep in mind with cats and dogs, it wasn't nearly as directed as that. So like all this stuff is kind of happening passively. So like what could have potentially happened with cats and dogs in a few decades took, again, hundreds or thousands of years, because like people, especially when dogs came around, they had no idea they could turn a wolf into something else. It had never been done before. So, and again, they certainly didn't have the time to do that. But I think there is some controversy that these foxes actually, that the Siberian group was using, were already from a farm. I'm going to get some of this wrong, but I think they were already they were very tame animals to begin with, and maybe already on the process to some sort of human-induced domestication. So what the Siberian group did was basically just finish the job, and maybe it may not have been that easy if they weren't taking foxes from the wild and doing this. They were taking foxes that are already very used to being around humans and doing this.
Although, one more contrast on that, when I used to work with SPCA and field investigations where we'd go around the country on criminal cruelty cases, we saw in dogfighting cases, we saw puppies that were 12 weeks to 16 weeks old, and they were already highly dog aggressive. Yeah. And that was because those people were selectively breeding for dog aggression.
Exactly.
So you can make those changes if it's directed, it's intentional.
Yeah, you certainly can. I mean, and that's how they came. I mean, it was nobody waved a magic wand and transformed the genome of cats and dogs. It happened because of people either actively or passively. It was people either purposely or accidentally selecting for, I want this animal has to be tame, or it's going to be killed, or it's not going to be fed, and that leads to, okay, this animal's tame. This animal has to do a job for me. Otherwise, it's going to be killed, or I'm going to kill it, or I'm going to ostracize it from the village or whatever. And so what people were doing was a much more sort of low-key way of what the Siberian group were doing. And then just one more point, speaking of reintroducing wild genes, I mean, some people have this bright idea of crossing wolves with dogs. I think they're going to get this dire wolf from Game of Thrones or whatever. And what ends up happening is they often get the worst of both worlds. They get an animal that's not afraid of people, that's also very aggressive towards people, which is like the worst possible combination. So these genomes can be changed, sometimes dramatically and sometimes in very short order.
So I'm the big picture I'm the big picture question person on this. So along with the evolution of like our relationship with cats and dogs, and how, I really did find it fascinating how they were domesticated, is the evolution of the pet industry, which I also find fascinating. Is that something you could kind of touch upon, is along with, cats becoming our pets and acquiring rights, is also this multi-billion-dollar industry of food and vets and stuff like that. Again, going back to my uncle's lampshade store, I don't know why I'm bringing this up so much. He got like a bag of the cheapest whatever, because that was all that was available in the supermarket. He left it in one bowl. There was 10 cats, and then mostly this was in Brooklyn by Coney Island. In his mind, they fended for themselves. Oh, they know they'll take care of themselves. They'll be fine. And if one of them didn't come back, you see, sometimes it just happens. So can you kind of touch upon how he went from that, which me now in my 50s, I think is barbaric of my great uncle, to, I have 6 cats and not all of them eat the same brand. And I have to have different brands for different, because one of them, my Tucker, will look at a certain brand and I'm not eating this crap. Can you kind of touch upon how that developed alongside, everything to do with cats becoming such beloved pets? Is that something you could touch upon?
Yeah, one of the most startling statistics I came across in the story, in researching my book, was just how big the pet industry is in the U.S. And my book came out in 2012, and at the time, pet industry in the U.S. was a $60 billion industry, which made it, I think the 7th largest industry in the United States, which is just crazy to think about. And now it's $130 billion. in just over a decade, it's more than doubled. And it's so much money that I think at the time of my book, and I'm sure it's still the case, what we spend on pets is more than the GDP of like half the world's countries, not combined, but like half the world's countries don't have a GDP of what we spend on pets. Now, is that all cats and dogs? No, it's probably mostly cats and dogs. I mean, there's probably horses in there too, and other animals. But given that cats are in maybe 30% of U.S. homes and dogs are in maybe 45% of U.S. homes, something like that. The statistics on this are always a little bit fuzzy. It's by and large cats and dogs. And just to think, and that's because of the stuff you're talking about, Dan. It's because of the food. It's because of the vet care that's available now, and the doggy daycare, and the pet sitters, and everything else. And yeah, my cats are the same way. Like, I think it's this weird circle. I don't want to call it a vicious circle, but it's this weird circle where we feed our animals. It's one of my favorite. All the terminology around pets has changed so much too. It's like we don't no longer. We as you guys know, we adopt pets now. You used to just like, I don't even remember what the terminology used to be. You would buy them, or you would get them, or whatever you would do from a shelter. But one of my favorite examples of that, is that livestock get feed and cats and dogs get food. I love that,
Yeah.
and it says everything. It says everything, right? Because it says we are treating them like people, and that goes along. When I was a kid, our cats got like Meow Mix, and nothing against Meow Mix, but it's probably not. It's probably like eating potato chips 24/7, and now my cats eat. Now in my family, my cats eat. This high quality. Grain free. I don't think it's locally sourced, but it's like
Almost.
yeah, probably. And you can get that. I mean, you can get that certainly for dogs, at least, and probably for cats as well. You can get the raw food and the locally sourced and the organic and stuff like that. We haven't gone quite that far, but it's and compared to sort of what they were eating just a few decades ago. But to my circle argument, it's sort of like we feed them that because we want them, because we view them as people, or as family members, and because we view them as family members, we feed them that, and the food in these cans is probably, talking about a lot of the rest of the world, it's probably better than what people are eating in large portions of the globe. I mean, just the quality of the nutrients, the freshness. Well, it's probably not that fresh, but the quality of the meat and stuff like that, it's insane. This all starts again probably in the early to mid 1900s, where you have the rising status of these animals. All of a sudden, well, I'm not certainly, there wasn't grain-free dog food back in the 1940s, but there was this move. People used to give their pets table scraps, whatever's left over from this, chicken bone or whatever, the dog gets that. Maybe not even feeding the cat. Cat can go out and hunt at night. We're not going to feed the cat. The cat's going to go out and get its own meals. To this idea, well, I wouldn't treat a family member like that, right? And so now, and again, stepping out of circle, it's like people are willing to pay for this. So this stuff starts being provided. And because this stuff starts being provided with these fancier and fancier foods, well, I can't give my cat or dog the less fancy food. Now, I go to PetSmart or Petco. It's just like a grocery store. I mean, there's shelves and shelves of this stuff. Okay, well, now I got to feed them better food. Oh, now you're buying better food. Well, there's this even better food. Well, of course, this is a family member. So, it's just like all this stuff really feeds on each other.
Absolutely. I had a friend that used to boil chicken and pasta and broccoli for her Shih Tzu. And he had I forget the brand. It was a very high-end dry food, and that was his food. And I had to watch him for about 6 weeks when she had her apartment redone. And every night she would send, weekly, she would send me, my freezer was full of chicken cutlets for him, and I had to boil them, and he ate it. This dog had a healthier diet than I did. For those, I'm ordering Chinese food. I'm eating like crap. He's eating, boiled, steamed food. Half the time I'm thinking maybe I should just share his food. I'd probably lose a couple of...
Right. And, I think the interesting thing with a lot of stuff is it becomes more socially acceptable. Like if you had said 30 years ago, I'm giving my dog this raw food diet, or, this grain-free blah, blah, people would have thought you were an absolute crazy person, right? And now it's completely socially acceptable to do that, to the point where, like, in any major city, there's doggy bakeries. It's like, I live in New York City, but even when we were in Baltimore, they had a doggy bakery. It's just like, like I'm going to go in and like these cookies look delicious, but you wouldn't eat them. But like they're like they're baking. They're in the back way. They're in the back of this shop baking goods, baked goods for dogs. It's, can you imagine talking to somebody like maybe even in the 70s, the 60s or 70s about that? We thought you were just completely off your rocker.
And David,
even in the 80s, I mean, I grew up, cats and dogs, and it was literally, we would just let the dog outside. We would let, the cats, we would let outside and the dog outside, and then call it and come back in. And then at the end of the night, and that was fine. There was no such thing as, there was no curbing your dog. There was also, I lived upstate New York, so I'm not from down here. Maybe it was different on Long Island. I don't know. But like they would just roam, and then they came in at night, and well, hopefully they came in at night, and you'd feed them whatever you would feed them. There was no real thought to it. It was just, it is what it is.
Michelle, a week ago, I had to take one of my cats, Jenny, in to see a neurologist at a major hospital. And she's fine, okay? Yeah. But when I tell people this, they often express concern, but no one bats an eyelash that I saw a neurologist for my cat in a 24/7 hospital. Yeah.
Yep, it's amazing. And it actually reminds me, I wanted to bring up, David, earlier you were talking when I think Dan had asked you about the evolution, like when animals started to become more, domesticized and things like that. And you mentioned that, there was a time in the, before cat litter was invented, before, the dog food was invented, before flea and tick medicine was invented. And it's such a difficult concept to wrap our heads around because, well, my entire life, Dan and I are about the same age, our entire lives, there's been cat litter. There's been flea and tick medicine. I mean, we have an abundance of choice nowadays, but like there's always been those products. So I guess we just kind of assume that they've always been there in some form or another. But it makes perfect sense that they didn't exist once. Somebody had to invent them at some point. It's it's such a foreign concept to think about that time when those things didn't exist,
100%. Yeah. Just shows how, this always sort of comes up when I talk about the book, or at least I try to bring it up, which is that, because I sort of write about cats and dogs and our relationship with them as this magical thing, and we've reached this sort of magical point, and isn't it amazing? And I believe that, but I also realize that, what's happening in the U.S. and in Canada and, and a lot of Europe is not true for a lot of the rest of the world. I mean, we were just in Morocco a couple weeks ago, and cats are kind of revered there in a way. They're in a way it's much more of a cat culture there than a dog culture, having to do, I believe, with some tenets of Islam, but don't quote me on that. But cats are they're living hand to mouth on the street. They're probably living a couple years if they're lucky. They're not indoor pets at all. This is a poor country where, again, people, they got to think about themselves. And yet it's a poor country where people are barely sort of getting by in a lot of cases. And yet these butchers, they're still tossing meat to the cats on the street because that's just what you do, and you take care of them. But, and this is true in a lot of South America as well. Like cats and dogs are they're not indoor pets. They're not family members. People may care about them, and maybe people view them as pets, but this relationship we have, and even in the U.S., it's not monolithic in the U.S. too. There's certainly pockets of the U.S. where this is probably not the case, but and so every time I start to go like, gosh, this is so magical and amazing, and like, how did we get here? And it's not really true for a lot of the world.
Right. So I also wanted to bring up, which I find this interesting, you kind of glossed over this before, that you have a PhD, and what you didn't say was that it was in genetics. which I think is fascinating because I feel like that ties everything together. Because you said you wanted to be a vet when you were younger, and now here you are, kind of an expert on the history, the genetics, if you will, the evolution of animals, of household pets. I think it's very interesting that you kind of started off studying genetics. I'm assuming it was human genetics, but now here you are, with this book and all this knowledge and expertise on the genetics of animals, which I think is really pretty cool. Like, kind of, I don't know, as far as I can see, like full circle type of moment.
I like that too, because I really do feel like, I've always been an animal lover. I wanted a career where I was with animals, and then I sort of drifted away from that and came back to that kind of in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's been nice to sort of be immersed in that again.
Right.
Which leads me to my next question. Where do you think we're going from here in terms of the relationship with cats and dogs? Can you speculate on the next 10 or 20 years? Do you see anything changing? Like a more closer integration? I've often thought one of my cats would make a better president. This is not a political podcast, but half the time my cat could have made a better speech. Where do you see this going in terms of, you literally just said, in many respects we've reached this wonderful sort of kumbaya, and I agree with that. I can't tell you how many times I've canceled plans or dates because I've chosen to spend the evening with my cats and Netflix. That is not sarcastic. That's actually true. I've found the companionship with them to be more appealing than getting dressed, going on a date, pretending I care what they do for a living, any of that stuff. Where do you see this? Where do you see this going? Is that something you'd want to speculate on?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of write about this towards the end of the book because I'm trying to future cast a little bit and see where, on this trajectory, where do things go? And I think a couple of things, getting back to other countries, I think what is changing, which we're already seeing, is that this is increasingly not just a phenomenon of the Western world. Cats and dogs are huge in Japan, in China, which they've never really been popular pets, apparently, and I read this on the internet, so take it for what it's worth, but apparently cats are the most popular a pet in urban China now, which is crazy, because this hasn't traditionally been a culture that has put a ton of value in these animals, and I realize I'm probably overstating that, and again, treating China as a monolith. But so I think we'll see what's happened in the U.S. and some of the Western world happening in other countries. But also in the U.S., I don't know if we can get any closer to these animals emotionally. That's almost a little scary to think about, because I think we've almost sort of maxed that out. And so I think the evolution will be potentially legally. I talked a little bit about how cats and dogs used to be nothing legally, and now they're property. And even when they got this property status, they're still in that status. Some people have a really hard time believing that. They're like, I don't view my cat or dog as a toaster, but legally they're pretty much still kind of toasters. I mean, they, with exceptions. I mean, you wouldn't give a lawyer to a toaster. Dogs aren't getting lawyers left and right. There's only been a few cases, but it has happened. Custody battles aren't being fought over toasters. People are starting to get emotional distress damages for cats and dogs being killed, which you usually reserve for people. You can leave money to your pets now legally, which you didn't. So none of this stuff is true of other types of property. And yet cats and dogs still remain property, because either you're nothing, you're property, or you're a person. There's really no gray area as far as the law is concerned. And so the question is, will this change for cats and dogs, as they become more integrated into society and more sort of emotionally and socially part of our lives? One of the people I talked to towards the end of this book is a legal theorist named David Favor. He has this concept called living property, which is this idea that, okay, we don't have a category, but let's create this category where we could put pets and maybe farm animals or other types of animals in this category, where these animals would have some rights, maybe the right to be free from abuse and the right to be cared for, maybe even some rights to some basic, veterinary care or whatever. But we wouldn't have to sort of broach this idea of legal personhood with these animals. Like, we could sort of keep our hands off that, because that's very controversial, as I sort of brought up earlier. But this idea that legally we could maybe evolve them into this new status. And so I think that may be an area where we see some changes maybe in the coming decades. But beyond that, unless they're eating the exact same food we're eating and going to the exact same doctors we're going to, it's hard to imagine a whole lot more evolution happening on the social side.
What do you think the chances are of me being able to claim them as dependents?
Yeah, my aunt used to do my taxes, and before my wife and I had kids, I would always joke. I'm like, why can't I? She was actually a big cat person too. She is a big cat person, and I would say, why can't we claim them as dependents? We're not quite there yet. I wonder if that might change. I don't know. I wonder if there's even a movement to do that. But you aren't the first person that's brought that up.
Yeah. Well, let's start the movement. I think that's what we need to do. Let's get this movement going.
One thing that's certainly changed in New York City is people bring their dogs into restaurants all the time. There have been articles about it in the Times where they say that restaurant owners won't refuse them. And I've seen it in restaurants. People walk in holding their dogs. They're not on the floor, but they hold them and they put them in their lap and no one says anything.
Yeah, again, that's a fairly recent, not super recent, but it's a pretty recent phenomenon, that's, again, there's so much has to happen for that to happen. The restaurants have to allow it. Other customers and patrons have to be okay with that. If other patrons weren't okay with that or was viewed as not socially acceptable, it wouldn't be happening. And the fact that nobody bats an eye now anymore, especially when you're out doing outside seating, and the waiter brings the dog a bowl of water. I've seen that happen. It's just like, it's like the dog's being served as well. It's crazy. I haven't seen any cats at restaurants. I don't know if you have, Stephen, but
I've always wanted to bring mine to a restaurant. I've always said I would, but I haven't.
my guess is that probably wouldn't be fun for anybody, but
right.
I could be wrong.
Well, you see, there's a few people that are, I guess they'd be considered travel bloggers or I'm not sure what they're considered, but they're creators where you see people traveling with their cats. Like they ride their bike cross country or they're doing an, international trek from, India to, I don't know, Germany or something. And you see them with cats in like backpacks or in a little basket of the bike. I cannot imagine either of my cats or any cat I've ever had sitting. It's just being okay with that and just sitting still enough and not running away and jumping. I can't even imagine. That's got to be a special type of cat that can go along for that kind of ride.
I always have mixed feelings about that stuff because on the one hand, I am so glad. I think if any animal needs good PR or better PR, it's cats. They're by almost any count, they're either the world's most popular or second most popular pet, and yet most people hate cats. I think that's just the fact of the matter. Even in the U.S., where cats are an incredibly popular pet, they have terrible PR. People that don't, especially obviously people that don't own cats. And so to see them out there, that's been one of the great things about the internet is that, because you would always see dogs, you'd see dogs, even if you didn't own a dog, you would see a dog playing Frisbee or, you were seeing dogs all over the place and chances are interacting with dogs. And I think that helped the reputation of dogs so much. And cats were shut-ins, literally, And so to see them on YouTube doing fun stuff, doing cool stuff, doing this travel stuff, I think it's just such great PR that these are great animals too. People love them. They can adapt to people in a lot of the same ways dogs do. I think the thing I worry about maybe more with cats than with dogs, having known cats for my whole life, is the cat enjoying this, right? Because I can't remember which cat it was. I don't know if it was Grumpy Cat or Little Bub or one of the really famous internet cats, but the owner of the cat had the opportunity when this cat became very famous to sort of travel the world with the cat and do signings. And he said, I'm not going to do that because it would be great for the book, but it'd be terrible for my cat. He would hate it. He would absolutely hate it. And why am I going to stress my cat out on a plane or traveling around the country? It's clearly not something he wants to do. And because I care about his well-being and his stress levels, that's something I'm not going to. I'm not saying these travel bloggers are in the wrong. I'm just saying that because I've seen cats surfing, and the cat could get the heck off that surfboard probably if the cat wanted to. So, I think it's up to the individual cat, but I would hope that everybody's keeping the best interests of the cats in mind here too.
Oh, I know, Stephen, I know you wanted to close with, you had a question you wanted to close with.
Well, you may get the last question. I actually wanted to read a quote from, and the question I was going to ask, you've already asked, Dan, about the future. So, but I was wondering if I could read a short quote from David's book to kind of close with. Would that be okay, David?
Please.
Yeah. So this is, you're outside at this moment with Jasper, and you say, we both stare off into the distance. He wants to be out in the world, but he also wants to be here with me. I know I won't have him forever, but I have him now. So here we stand, two species drawn together over millennia, bonded by love and law. Who knows what the future will bring? For now, he has me, and I have him, my pet, my friend, my family.
Yeah, I'm going to start crying. Especially since he's since passed away. But yeah, I mean, I think, I guess maybe just to close, I think, people give cats a hard time, especially people that don't like cats or don't know cats, for being sort of wild and antisocial and aloof and all this other stuff. But I think almost anybody who's owned a cat knows that that's not true, that these are animals that are deeply bonded with people and deeply part of our lives. And that was always was something we didn't get into. Maybe if we do ever do a part two is, when we were in Baltimore, we used to walk our cats. We lived in this we still lived in the city in Baltimore, but kind of a little bit removed from downtown. And we lived in this kind of suburban feeling neighborhood where we could take our cats out on with leashes. And we met a lot of people that way because we were the crazy cat people. But eventually Jasper and Jezebel usually just stuck around the house, but Jasper and I would go for walks without the leash. Like, he would go outside, and he might run away from me for a couple minutes and, chase something into a bush or go sneak off somewhere. But he would always come back. He would always come home, and he would always come back to me. And this idea that, like, that's so against what his ancestor was. His ancestor was an animal that wanted nothing to do with people and wouldn't want to be anywhere near humans or human civilization or human activity. And now here we have these animals that just, they've got their own mind and their own opinions and all this other stuff. But, like, fundamentally, there's almost nowhere in the world, except for, I think, in the outback of Australia, where cats live, where domestic cats live, where there aren't people. The cats are always next to people, whether they're living in our houses or they're living in as sort of ferals in our neighborhoods. They're bonded to us as people and as a society. And I think that's something a lot of people don't give them credit for, that this is part of their nature. Is they've still got a little bit of a wild part of their nature, but part of their nature is to be part of our lives one way or the other. And that's what I think that I was trying to get that with Jasper, that I loved him more than almost anything in the world. And I felt that reciprocated because we were out there and he could have been 50 other places and he's sitting there with me. It was just a remarkable thing.
I love that quote. I absolutely love that quote. I could not agree with that sentiment more. My cat, I've had a cat that's literally saved my life from a very dark period of my life just by being a cat. So all this evolution, all this history brings to the point where this one cat was able to sense, you going through some shit, man. I'm going to be there for you. Just by laying on my face, he kept me from going down a very dark path. So I love that quote because I could not agree more. From two walks of life, two different species. He could have been anywhere else, and I just love it. David, there will definitely be a part two because we could talk to you for days. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much.
Citizen Canine, Our Evolving Relationship with Cats and Dogs, is available everywhere you get your book. There it is. It's also an audiobook. So wherever you get your audiobooks. David, thank you so much for joining us. This was amazing, an amazing eye-opening experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. It was really wonderful. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thanks.
And we'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.